Today we are going to be talking about if starting a nonprofit is right for you. We're hopefully going to get to know everyone a little bit better. So first of all, I do have a quick little poll just to see where everyone is in the process. So if you just want to answer that real quick here, we'll see where everybody is. If you're somebody just getting started, if you've recently filed, um, any of those sorts of things, if those options apply to you. And if they don't, that's what the none of the above is for. All right. Okay. Have someone just popping in. So thank you for attending this. I've got a poll right up on the screen. Hopefully you can see it if you just joined. We are just kind of seeing where everybody is in their starting a nonprofit process. So I'll give you a moment to be able to read that and answer if you want to. Then I will share the results with everyone. All right. So it looks like we probably got everybody here. All right. So we are apparently extremely evenly split between folks who are just getting started, who have their ideas or who are looking to see if this is the right sort of thing for them, and folks who generally help other people start nonprofits. So that's going to be kind of an interesting dichotomy to work with. All right. So moving right along, though, I'll first talk just a little bit about Forefront as an organization in case anyone isn't completely aware. We're a statewide membership organization for nonprofits, grant makers, and advisors. We try to help provide education and workshops like these, networking opportunities, advocacy through some of our policy team, and other things to try to help advance the nonprofit sector as a whole. In this, the library has a place where we have a specialized collection dealing with nonprofit resources. We help support our members by doing remote research for them. And we do workshops like these that are frequently open to everyone and not just our members. So the library's website is listed there. We are also a member of Candid's Funding Information Network. Candid used to be known as Foundation Center until their merger with GuideStar. They are now Candid. They are the ones who publish the Foundation Directory Online database and provide the nonprofit startup assessment tool that we'll be looking at later in this session. They also have a website called Candid Learning that we'll take a quick look at when we go to look at that assessment tool. That also is a place where you can look at workshops and a few sample documents and other things. All right, currently we are still physically closed as a library, so we are only reaching out to people virtually at this point in time. Hopefully that will change in the not terribly distant future, but currently we are an online-only presence. You can see some of our resources that are freely available on our website, and you can, of course, ask us questions. All right, so now, quick tour of what we're hoping to accomplish in our time together today. First, I'm going to outline the steps involved in starting a nonprofit. Then, I'm going to provide some guidance on how to help you assess any of the alternatives to starting one. Also going to provide a tour of the nonprofit startup assessment tools I mentioned, which you can use to determine your next steps depending on where you are in the whole process. And finally, I'll direct you to some additional resources that can help you along your journey. That will include the actual URL for the tool that I mentioned. Also, I have a handout that I'll be sending out that has a variety of links that can be very useful for people before. If, and I'm going to bet this is pretty unlikely, but if you have taken a look at Candid's nonprofit startup assessment tool, let us know about it in the chat. Or if you've used any kind of nonprofit assessment tool, let us know kind of how that worked and if it gave you any kind of useful lessons for it. All right, so since everyone's usually in a slightly different place, and that's going to mean you're going to take different things back with you, I'll want to make sure I get any of your really important questions answered. So if you have a question at any point, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll try to make sure to answer those as we go. My colleague, Zoe McGarrick, is also on the session today, and I believe she's going to help me keep an eye on the chat and call out things if I am not aware of them. Right. Now, before we get into it, I would like to make it clear I am not a lawyer. I am not an accountant. I cannot interpret legality of anything anyone has in mind. I will talk about some resources that you'll have access to that can help provide those sorts of answers. Um, but that is that is what a librarian does. We'll kind of provide research and resources, but please don't ask me to balance your books, and I cannot give any kind of legal advice. All right, so first, just a real quick, what is a nonprofit organization? All right, let's explore this legal definition a little bit. This is the IRS's definition, specifically from their code about the Section 501c3. So, exclusively for one or more charitable purposes. That's kind of the most important characteristic of a public charity is its focus on these purposes. The IRS also has a long definition of all of those. Easiest way to understand it is that they're set up to benefit other people rather than the organization. In other words, the nonprofit must be organized and operated exclusively for one or more charitable purposes. Right. No benefit to private individuals, shareholders, or private interests. Kind of reiterating that even more in detail here. A nonprofit is different from a for profit organization. It cannot be set up to benefit investors or to help someone get rich. You can be paid, of course, to work for a nonprofit. I am, for instance, but that can't be the sole reason it exists. It has to be helping other people in some fashion. And that it does not attempt to influence legislation or participate in a political campaign as a substantial part of its activities. Substantial is doing a lot of work in that sense in particular. It cannot be solely a political organization. You can't advocate for policies and political issues. You can occasionally, but frequently it cannot be specific advocacy, like vote for this person. If you're really not sure about how this works and how it relates to your plans, the IRS also has a detailed description of nonprofits and lobbying that you can look at. In fact, since I've mentioned that about 3 times in quick succession, I will also, real quick in the chat, put the IRS's specific website that has its section about nonprofits and charities. All right. So, speaking of that IRS, we will have this one slide detail on the legal elements of starting a nonprofit. This isn't the major focus of this workshop. We're talking a little more about kind of mindsetting and resources. You might not even get to this part if you're really just in the idea stage. But we're going to start with it because a lot of people think that these are the most important steps to starting your nonprofit. And it isn't, but it is kind of simple to get out of the way. These are just the legal steps to becoming a tax-exempt organization. We'll talk more after this to discuss elements of nonprofits operations, but these steps are here for anyone who is not familiar with them. That you have to have an established board of directors, you'd have to develop your own bylaws and board policies, that you have to file your articles, obtain an EIN, and file for the actual tax exemption. That's what gets you official tax exempt status. Now, when we talk about these legal steps of class, we recommend that you don't do it alone. The language of a lot of legal documents requires a certain structure that is much easier to negotiate with the help of someone who is practiced in that. Lawyers, for example, aren't cheap though, but frequently you can reach out to like the local bar association to see if there are any kind of pro bono services, free or donated services that are offered in your area. There is also the Chicago Community Law Project offered by the Chicago Civil Lawyers Committee. They run a very thorough boot camp for people who are wanting to start up nonprofits that does go over helping people with all of that kind of legal paperwork. So highly recommend checking them out. Their URL will be on the handout with other resources, but you can also just find them by Googling Chicago Community Law Project. But we work with them. I actually have presented a small piece on searching for funding for nonprofits during their boot camp. So full disclosure, have worked with them, think they're great. All right. So if you are going to do it by yourself, though, make sure you are very carefully following the instructions. Definitely check out that IRS website that I put in the chat. There is within that the life cycle of a charity is one of the pages that will list what forms you need to start and continue your nonprofit. There are also publishers. NOLO, for example, is one of the most well-known that publish books on all of the legal process. That might also help you kind of get started on that sort of thing. But these steps constitute kind of the bare bones legal definition of starting a nonprofit. Even if you follow this all to the letter, you're simply legally a nonprofit. What you probably want is to substantially be a nonprofit, something that people are going to invest in and rely on. So to get to all of the main components of a nonprofit, we're going to talk about a nonprofit plan. So I know everyone's in a slightly different place when it comes to your plans, but that's fine because this is for everyone who wants to make their nonprofit the most effective as possible. There are lots of different nonprofits in lots of different areas, but there's one way to look at them on a very kind of simplistic scale is looking at whether or not the organization is fundable. And we talk about starting a nonprofit, you better generally start with the mission. The mission is the most important part of what you do. I have just received a small pop-up that my internet connection is unstable, so please do tell me if any of my audio gets interrupted so that I can make sure to repeat myself. So, the purpose of a nonprofit's mission statement. It can be an official definition of a mission. It's basically what you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, who you're helping, what you're doing, and why. Tells anybody who's interested from the IRS. Oh, so I froze before I saw that pop up. That's great. Okay. All right. So hopefully that didn't cut out anything too substantial. So I was going over the legal steps. If anybody needs me to go back over anything in particular, just let me know in the chat. So I don't know exactly where I was for a couple of minutes back there. But yeah, if you need me to go over anything, if it sounds like I didn't cover a slide at all, just let me know specifically what I need to go back over. All right. So mission statements, who you're helping, what you're doing, and why. It tells anybody who's interested, from the IRS to prospective donors to somebody you just run into at a party, what your organization stands for. Now, it is differentiated from your vision. The vision can go further than your mission. It doesn't say what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, but it does tell people what you're striving for, what you intend the world to look like if you're successful at what you do. Examples can include things like a world where every child can read by the age of 5, a world where clean water is available to everyone. This isn't the sort of statement that you can accomplish tomorrow or even in very short term, but it's what your day-to-day work is trying to help bring about. Okay, so moving on to values. So both your vision statement and your mission are based on your values. Now, if anybody wants to share what values they hold dear that are related to their nonprofit work, please feel free to toss that in the chat as well. It'd be something that we can definitely talk about. Values can be things that are deeply held beliefs that form kind of the rock layer of what your nonprofit's about, what you believe in, what is driving you, what you're passionate about. Those are the things you value. Those are your values. Your mission statement, your vision statement, communicate those values to everyone else in a formal manner. So when you're telling the story of your nonprofit and you're trying to interest other people in it, you're trying to find people who share these values. When we talk about grant seeking, for example, we talk about finding funders whose interests are a fit with yours. Another way of saying that is that they share your values. Um, for example, Bill Gates has been very clear about his foundation's values. He and his wife value education, international health, the use of technology for everyone. Those values inform how the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gives. They generally look to find and fund nonprofits whose mission and vision statements express an embracing of those sorts of values. Now, just because a funder is interested in the same population or issue as you does not necessarily mean that the funder or that person shares your specific values. For example, you might assume that two different nonprofits who work with single mothers share values with one another. But without knowing more about their kind of core values, their ethical values, their religious values, political values, you can't really tell too much about how they're going about that, what vision it is they're working towards with that particular day-to-day work. Right, and I was asked to go back to the mission slide real quick since it got kind of zoomed past. So I believe I kind of mentioned all of this, but it is the statement that communicates your purpose, what group you're serving, how you're planning to do so. It's generally one of those kind of first statements because it's kind of how you put the idea you have about your nonprofit into words to communicate it to other people. If you have this idea that you want to help kids in after school programs, you might want to specifically say you're wanting to serve children in a disadvantaged neighborhood with this kind of program to help education. You want to kind of spell out the specifics of a thing. All right, so your mission, your vision, your values. Now, if we were doing this in person or if we had a big group, I'd probably try to put you into breakout rooms. But we really there are only a few folks here, so I'm not going to do that at the moment. We'll just kind of talk about this a little bit. So, for this exercise, give me just a moment. What you would be thinking about is for those of you who are in kind of the very beginning stages of your kind of nonprofit journey. This is where we would have you kind of think about your mission, your vision, and your values. Some of you may already have those sorts of statements down. You might have already crafted a mission or vision statement. But just remember, if you have not, and this is something that you're working on, mission is what you're doing every day, vision is what you're aiming for, and values are what underlies your organization as a whole. Now, if anybody has already come up with a mission or vision statement they would like to share, please feel free to do so. And a lot of these, if you were doing this exercise, when you would, write in some of those things, you might write in kind of just keywords. And then when you actually try to share it, you want to share it more like a story or an older business speech, an elevator speech. So that you can kind of share the story in just a couple of minutes, making sure that you're communicating everything you want to, that it is clear, and that you can grab somebody's interest with it. And this is kind of at the heart of what it means to be a nonprofit, being able to tell your story, communicate your passion through what you're saying about your organization. You will probably end up doing some version of this exercise, even if not in a formal way, over and over as your organization grows. All right, so moving on to the kind of the next part of the plan. Environmental scan. Sounds like a very kind of technical phrase. In essence, it just means now that you're clear on what you're wanting to do with your mission and vision sort of statements, is anybody else doing this work? Sometimes your environmental scan is easy. Did you get your idea from a nonprofit that's working successfully somewhere else but not near you? If you're thinking about your neighborhood and you have an original idea, it's good to make sure that it is totally original, that it's not something someone else is already working on. When you start a nonprofit and are trying to make a go of it, you're going to be trying to get support from funders, other nonprofits, individuals who all want to know why should they support your new idea? What makes it distinct? What makes it innovative? what makes it essential for your area? So thinking about these points, how do you differ from other nonprofits in your area? What is it you do that nobody else is doing? And what would happen if your organization didn't exist? That can often be uh, highlighting kind of the negative outcomes if things aren't improved or helped. Now, there are places to find information on existing nonprofits. You can even just try Googling things sometimes. There's also GuideStar, which does have free accounts. If you are familiar with GuideStar, that's great. If you're not, they have, at the very least, bare bones profiles on any organization that files a 990. And anyone from those organizations can make a claim to their organization's profile and flesh it out and fill it out further to give yourselves kind of that online presence. That website is used in a number of kind of affiliate programs and by a number of funders and things. A lot of your like big banks that oversee donor advised funds, you know, your U.S. Bank, Bank of America, that sort of thing. Looking through GuideStar is one of the places they'll look to find out information or vet nonprofits themselves. So it's generally very useful to have your profile claimed and filled out a little bit there. Um, it's pretty easy to do, and it is free to do that part. You do not have to have a professional subscription in order to claim and fill out your profile. Um, Now, there are, you know, that is very useful for a lot of reasons there. So that is definitely something I kind of recommend. If you do find nonprofits who are doing similar work to the ones you do, but not exactly the same, uh, it's also great to look those up and talk to someone from them. If they're similar to you and not the same, you're probably going to want to, you know, collaborate or work together on something in the future. So building those relationships can be a really good idea early on as well. All right. So next, now that we kind of know what it is we want to do, know that it is something that is new, that isn't going to just be repeating something that someone else is already trying to do in the same area, putting the team together. As you form your nonprofit, your board members are essential working parts. A lot of nonprofits don't start to hire staff at first. Board members frequently also double as volunteers, as well as expertise, and as donors frequently to their organizations. All of these roles don't cover everything about the board. They're representatives of the public that make your organization a public charity. Besides being legally essential to a nonprofit, they are the people who are officially in charge of the nonprofit. They can, though it happens fairly rarely, decide to fire an executive director. What they're always responsible to is the organization's mission statement. Now, the search for great board members, ones that will give their time, their talent, and often funds as well, is a never ending sort of effort for a nonprofit. Finding initial board members can be very crucial. These are people whose passion for the mission matches your own, who are able to bring a particular skill to help. Um, you could really have an entire other session just talking about the board. But first, we're just going to, but for now, we're just going to talk about a couple of resources. As is called out on the slide there, Board Source is a great website to find out more information about the logistics of running a nonprofit board. They are a nationally recognized authority on the subject and have a lot of free and inexpensive resources. So they have a number of articles, they have some examples of things. They also have ebooks if anybody is interested in purchasing things on the topic as well. For recruiting board members, you'll want to see who is in your area. You can look at things like Idealist or Chicago Cares that does volunteer matching, or other kinds of, you know, nonprofit networking things to try to find people who are interested in your, you know, particular organization. And if this is something where you're starting out and you're kind of looking for new board members, if you're already established enough that you're kind of just kind of changing out board members, if your organization is a member of Forefront, we also have a job board for members if you wanted to put up any kind of open positions for your organization there. That is, however, just for members, so that keep that kind of in mind there. All right. So if anybody else has, I know we have a couple of other people who help nonprofits, so If you have any big recommendations on how to find board members or sources that are great for that, feel free to also share those in the chat. Now, ideally, looking at staff members, you want to grow your organization with paid staff. Um, However, until finances and fundraising are really reliable, uh, you might not have anyone who is being paid. You might have volunteers. It might just be kind of you and the board. A lot of nonprofits can have very small staffs and still be very effective. Now, not everyone should be drafted as a board member, although it might start to sound like that the way I've been talking. Board members should be those who have the time and passion to be a pretty big part of the organization. You may want to have a separate group of volunteers who don't want the sort of commitment of being a board member, but work in a more formal and informal advisory capacity or just kind of part time helping out. Uh, if you're working with volunteers, there can be all sorts of volunteers for an organization. I volunteered with an animal shelter. So I go in like twice a week to walk dogs. It's not really a huge part of the organization, but it is important to what it is they're doing. Uh, but it's not anything on kind of the level of some of the other volunteers who just donate more time or people who are more fully involved in the organization. If you want kind of more information on a lot of these topics, you can also check out Candid's Learning site. Again, you mentioned we'll visit that on our way to looking at the nonprofit assessment tool. But it is also just learning.candid.org if anybody already wanted to have that written down. All right, so moving on to our next section though, the need. So once you kind of have your team started, you want to begin planning out how your program is going to go. But as you do that, the number one concern is identifying the need you are filling or answering. The need is the need the community you're serving has. You have to be able to document it. How do you know this is a problem for the people you're working with? It may be obvious, but it's not going to be obvious to everyone. So how do you document it for potential funders, potential individual donors, even potential volunteers? How are you going to outline this? Sometimes it's specific anecdotal examples. You might have representatives from the community on your board, people who can share personal experience and talk about the things they have seen and experienced themselves. Sometimes you have statistics, which can be gathered through surveys or through other kinds of research. Government agencies like the Census Bureau or your city or county may collect statistics you can use. There are also universities and even the news media may have done so too. Um, I know the Lilly School does a lot of work collecting some information on these sorts of topics as well. So that's definitely, an, part of a university that can be looked into as well. So any of this can provide the documentation you need, the clear answer to the question, why is your organization necessary? This need statement is one part of the case you make, the case for support for your organization. It's an essential part of telling the story. Now, once you have that kind of firmly in mind, programs and services generally flow directly from the need, like in a story. Here is the problem, here are the potential solutions. Now, for anyone who's put together a grant proposal before, this looks familiar. Program design requires to think broadly about things like goals and then more specifically about outcomes. You may even use that sort of model to outline this. The benefit of that sort of structure is that it can lead you to understand that funders and other investors want to know what specific outcomes you're striving for and how you're going to measure success. Planning ahead means that you collect some of that data and information that'll be necessary to evaluate it. This is another part of making your case. So, in that sort of thing, you want to make sure that you know what it is you'll be measuring or, that you are going to be collecting information there. This doesn't always have to be quantitative. It doesn't have to be, X% of people did this thing. It can be more qualitative. It can be success stories. It can be, interviews with people who've gone through a program and had it affect their lives. But it is still all part of making the case. And that case leads to the whole finances and fundraising piece. Budgeting and anything financial might be the scariest part of a new nonprofit. How do you know what everything's going to cost if you haven't done this before? Or even if you have, if it's a different type of organization, it might not all, transfer over what you've done before. Budgeting is simply the numerical representation of everything that you've planned out so far. You've justified the need for this money by making your case. Now you need to say where the money is going to go. The more detail you have on your programs, the more you'll know what expenses you're going to be covering. Now, you can find examples of uh, budget proposals for grants sometimes. A lot of those will be on kind of specific sets of programs, and they'll involve not just the expenses, but income from things as well. If you're going to be charging anything for, a program, or if you're going to be receiving money in some other fashion about it. Where do you get most of your funding, though? Before you can win foundation grants, a nonprofit needs to demonstrate a history of diversified fundraising, including individual donations. This can be very tricky for nonprofits just starting out. Um, that's why we'll also kind of talk a little bit about fiscal sponsorship here in a moment. Um, Individual donations are going to be a big part of this, both because it can, frankly, be a little easier to kind of reach out to individuals, people that you know, or in any kind of circle of acquaintance, or reach out to that way, rather than foundations, especially initially, and especially if they're looking for having any kind of established presence. Now, sometimes you can also talk about your experience, the experience of your board, of your staff, even if the nonprofit organization itself is new. There are sometimes also ways to kind of demonstrate that history without it being the current exact nonprofit. Um, but you just want to try to balance these things, because having different sources of income is usually most stable for a nonprofit, so that you're not relying on any one source too much. We've had a couple of people representing nonprofits come into the library who were trying to search for foundation funding for the first time in, gosh, for one of them, it was decades, because they'd had one specific funder who'd been more or less bankrolling the nonprofit organization for years and years. And then they had passed on, and they were kind of left in the lurch with nothing to fill in that gap. A little more of this question is also, of course, the basis for an entirely different class as well. We occasionally present that one. It's called Introduction to Fundraising Planning. So we will move on a little bit from that. Now, before we go on to an entirely different piece, a word about financial management. Having only one person handle all of your checks, keep all of the accounts, and make all the financial decisions is frequently a recipe for disaster. But who can help with that? Well, other than your board, being on the lookout for local and statewide resources can help nonprofits. There are a lot of organizations out there that kind of help people oversee some back office things. In fact, one of them is simply called the Back Office Collaborative. Here at Forefront, we have a organization we support called Converge Consulting that helps people with kind of a lot of administrative needs as well. So if there's any kind of issue there, frequently it can make a lot of sense to have somebody who is handling some of those kinds of tasks for multiple nonprofits handle yours, rather than trying to handle everything in-house. That can also be a step to worry about much later than initially when you were just getting started, but it is something to keep in mind. All right. And of course, nobody can support you if they don't know about you. Relying on just one way to get the word out is pretty risky. You have to think about who's going to be interested in what you're doing, and where do they get their information. Are you working with teens? Where are teens getting a lot of their information these days? Like, less than half kids under 18 use Facebook now. So knowing where you can actually reach your target audience is an important thing. Are you working with seniors? Where are they getting their information? Do the people you work with frequently go to church? Are they in school? Where is it they're likely to hear about things like this? Where are you going to be able to get your name out? Where are you going to be able to share flyers or be able to set up tables or even just talk to people or network virtually still, since we're mainly in that kind of space at the moment? Think about all the ways somebody in the community you're wanting to serve might find out about you. And don't just think in terms of what you will do. One of the best ways to spread the word about a new resource is to partner with an existing resource that has, an audience. We mentioned that the church sort of thing. If you are, going to be doing something that's helping kind of a broad community, working with, a church that has, a lot of social programs they also support is kind of a good way to get your name out there to the community around them. You can't exist in a vacuum as a nonprofit. At least if you operate without collaborative partners, it's probably not going to be. It's going to be a much harder road for you. All right. So other considerations. I know we've talked about a lot of things, but here are a few more just to kind of consider. Space. I know at the moment a lot of people are doing things virtually, but there's still frequently a lot of nonprofits who feel they just need building space to get started. If you're going to do programs that need to occur in a physical space, if you need offices, if you need anything, meeting space or any of that. Ways to think about that can be looking at shared space. Can you be in a space that's donated on some sort of part-time basis? Can you rent space in some sort of collaborative workspace? What is going to be enough for what it is you need to do? Equipment. What's essential for what you're going to be doing? Is it anything that can be donated? Is it anything that can be shared? Insurance. If you're working with children, you're going to have that along with background checks. If you're going to have a vehicle that's essential for your services, you'll need insurance. Sometimes the board may want insurance to cover them in the cases of legal liability for your organization. So knowing who provides insurance, who works with nonprofits in your area is important for that sort of thing. And human resources and annual reporting. As you grow, do you have policies for how you're going to handle employees? What your benefits will be? Do you know what's required for annual reporting from the state, for the IRS? Those are all kind of things to look into and to keep in mind as you go. All right. So now that we have poured all of that onto you, there might be one or two you were thinking that you might want to know more about what alternatives are to starting a nonprofit. Because you can do a lot of good work and you can also incorporate new ideas without creating an entirely new organization. Because you can still provide service to your community. So some suggestions here. Fiscal sponsorship, the one that's listed last on this slide, is a little more complicated, so we're going to talk about it first. The definition here, a legal arrangement between a 501c3 and an individual or group, giving the non-exempt entity access to the benefits of 501c3 without dealing with the administration side of operating. So that definition, the technical definition of a fiscal sponsorship arrangement. Basically, it is a way for someone or a group who might be working on becoming a nonprofit but hasn't yet, or even if you've just gotten your 501c3 but you're barely started, to partner with a more established existing nonprofit in order to try to obtain grants and other kinds of donations. It can sound relatively simple. You're finding someone who is willing to partner with you. They take on some of the financial responsibility while you are writing grant proposals and donation requests. However, it can be very complicated. Many fiscal sponsors do not do this for free. They can charge a percentage of your donations for administrative fees. They might have a flat fee sort of thing. There's a website that is Fiscal Sponsorship Directory that lists organizations that specialize in doing fiscal sponsorships, so you can see kind of the variety of what gets charged for that sort of practice there. There are kind of a number of pitfalls beyond that as well. So it can be a very kind of difficult relationship. It's one that you need to go into carefully. Make sure that you have found an organization that is a good fit, that is going to be one that will benefit you both generally in the long run. All right, so we'll go back up to that slide to look at the others shortly there. So that's the one that's a little complicated and is often kind of a stepping stone for people getting a nonprofit started, where you're still going to be creating your own nonprofit eventually. We worked with a gentleman a little while ago who was in the process of getting his nonprofit uh, disentangled from their longtime fiscal sponsor. His organization had more or less kind of outgrown the relationship and wanted to be more independent so that they could apply for grants that they hadn't been allowed to as a fiscal sponsor because the sponsoring organization generally had a kind of policy that was something both organizations qualified for. They would apply, but the sponsor would not be able to. So that they had to actually run anything they wanted to apply for by their fiscal sponsor first. And while that was fine for a while, especially with different kinds of grants out there came a point where they really wanted to grow more and thus needed to become more independent. But beyond fiscal sponsorship, other things, you might just volunteer at an organization. If that environmental survey turned up organizations who are doing work very similar to what it was you wanted to do, it might be a great idea to at least start by volunteering with one of them to kind of see what that work looks like on the ground if you haven't before. Uh, and that might even lead into the second one, finding employment with a similar sort of organization. You might find that you're a little happier not being the one who is responsible for getting everything up and going, that you want to work with someone who's already established, who's already got some connections, who is already in the space, so that you can kind of more quickly get ideas for specific programs or things up and running. Or you might be interested in serving on a board, especially again, if you found similar sorts of organizations. This can be a way to really help steer an organization and really be involved very deeply in it without having to take a lot of the risks of a new organization. All right. So, all of that being said, talking about what the advantages and disadvantages are of starting your own nonprofit. The reward for going through the process is your eligibility for grants, for people to take a tax deduction if they donate to you. The organization's income won't be taxable. The formal structure, where your board is in charge, means that no one person owns the organization. So if something terrible happens and the nonprofit goes bankrupt, then as long as board members had performed due diligence in good faith, there's not going to be a financial responsibility to pay back the nonprofit's debts. So that can often be a softer exit for people if something does go very wrong. And of course, you will have gotten your passion translated into this new organization that you helped start, which is kind of its own reward. Disadvantages. Starting a nonprofit is kind of costly. Those costs generally come out of the pocket of the funder and the board, at least very early on. There is a lot of paperwork for organizations. And since there's no one person who is completely in charge, there's shared control. An executive director or any single board member does not have everything his or her own way. Um, Again, that is the case in most parts of life, really. And it is all public. 990s, those financial documents to the IRS, are public documents that will show who your highest paid employees are, how much you're spending on fundraising, and other sorts of ideas. All right, so we are now going to switch shares so that I can show you the website real quick. All right, so I mentioned Candid Learning site. This is it, learning.candid.org. When you're on that page, you can look at articles on a wide number of things. You can look through their trainings. Some of their trainings are free. Others do have a fee associated with them. So make sure to just keep that in mind. We mentioned their sample documents. If you want to look at those, you will need to create a free account, but you can do that just by clicking that login and creating one. But for right now, we're interested in their nonprofit startup resources. So for that, at the very bottom of this page, it has resources specific to each state. So if you wanted to look at things about starting a nonprofit anywhere in the country, you can kind of look at those. But you can also look at and take the assessment. So it is, I believe it's 70 or so questions. They are separated into sections. You can save it and return to it. Uh, this is one that can assess any kind of number of the areas in starting a nonprofit. And it will look at your background knowledge, your capital, your work experience, all of the things to kind of go into it. And the results will kind of give you resources to help guide you on identifying funding, navigating the process, developing a business plan. They'll kind of show you where areas are that need some work, where you might be needing a little more assistance on things. Uh, that kind of that kind of tool will go through all of those things uh, in rather a fair amount of detail. So it is free to take. So if anybody is interested in that, you can do that at any time on your own, and that is going to be, possibly a very useful tool to you to just kind of see what it is they're saying. Your skills are needed, what knowledge you might need, and what it is they might be able to kind of provide additional resources for. All right. So that is more or less kind of the end of this presentation. If anybody has questions, please put them in the chat. We will try to answer anything you have to ask. And like I said at the beginning, I will hope to share out a link to the recording and the slides to this later this week. I'll just kind of talk to myself here for a moment in case anybody is typing up a detailed question in the chat. Also, since it is kind of the end of things and there are only a few of us here, if you want to unmute yourselves and actually ask your question out loud, also feel free to do that. All right. Well, it looks like people are slowly starting to head out for the day. So thank you very much for attending. I hope everyone has found this helpful, and I will let you have, you're very welcome. All right, well, I will let everybody have kind of an additional 7 minutes back to their day. Have a great day, everybody.